If you will, you can be turning to Hebrews chapter 9. Hebrews chapter 9. The next few chapters will be dealing with those things that we could classify as being technical. And then when you get into Hebrews chapter 11, chapter 12, and chapter 13, you're looking at some very practical things from those three chapters. But remember that the reason why this book was penned by inspiration was to encourage the Jewish Christians not to go back to Judaism, as some had already done, and it seems that some were in the process of doing. And that's why you have the words of encouragement, the words of exhortation, don't do this. Because if you go back to Judaism, you go back under the first covenant, the old covenant, then you're going back to that which is inferior. Because Christ and his covenant is superior in every way. Christ himself is superior, is better than the angels. Christ is better than the prophets of old. Christ is better than Moses, the lawgiver. Christ is better than Joshua, the one who provided, in a sense, a rest for the people in times past. But that rest which the Lord provides is far better. And with Christ you have a better covenant with better promises. And not only that, when you look at the priesthood of Christ, his priesthood is better than the priesthood under Levi, that is the Levitical priesthood. And so everything about Christ and his covenant, his testament, if you will, is better. Just think about the sacrifices that were made by the priests of old. And compare that with the sacrifice that Christ made. How he once for all gave himself for the sins of the people. And how that the priests in times past, they were continually offering sacrifices for people. And so everything about Christ and his covenant is far better. In chapter 8 and 9, we talk about the two covenants. There's the old covenant, also referred to as the first covenant. And then there's the new covenant or the second covenant, which has reference to the new law, the second law, in other words, the New Testament law. And then also we read about the tabernacle and how important that was to the people of God in times past. Now, if you go back and you spend a little time, remember at the beginning of this study of this book, and we'll consider that the highlights from the book of Hebrews, that you really have to study some things found in the Old Testament to understand some of these things stated here in the book of Hebrews. That means looking at, for example, the book of Exodus and looking also at the book of Leviticus. And if you don't do that, then we're not going to be able to fully understand what some of the things the Hebrews writer is talking about. Now, if you want to learn more about the tabernacle, go back and read Exodus chapter 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, and then those other chapters in the book of Exodus says something about the tabernacle. There's a lot of instructions given in the book of Exodus concerning the tabernacle. How it was to be built, the size of it, what the material was to be. In fact, in the tabernacle and also in the covering that reference to the outer court. Also in reference to the furnishings that were placed in the outer court, and then the furnishings that were placed in the holy place, that is the front section of the tabernacle, and then the furnishings that were placed in the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, which was the second part of the tabernacle. And so it describes that, where it was to be placed, and what material was to be used in making those things. The tabernacle was basically a tent, okay, that they could take down. And of course, as they traveled, they took the tabernacle with them. The tabernacle was approximately, and I say approximately, about 45 feet long by 15 feet wide. That's a tabernacle. And it always faced toward the east. Toward the east. And it was placed in what they refer to as the outer court. The outer court, there was sort of like what we would refer to as like a fence around the tabernacle. Made of curtains and so forth, and a certain number of posts that had to be used and all that kind of stuff. And the opening to that was also facing the east. And that was approximately 150 feet long by 75 feet wide. And in the outer court, as you walk through the curtain there in the outer court, facing toward the tabernacle itself, in the outer court, there was the altar, a brazen altar where sacrifices were made. And then there was the brazen vessel, what we would call like a large sink, if you will, that was placed there in front of the tabernacle, so that when the priest would go in, they would be washing their hands and washing their feet as well. And so that was there available for the priest. And so basically two furnishings, pieces of furniture, if you will, that was in the outer court before you get into the tabernacle, and which the priest would use. Now, as you would go into the tabernacle, a large curtain, and as you would enter into the tabernacle, the front section here that you enter into was known as the holy place. And the only ones that could go into there were the priests. The priests, that's the only ones. And in the holy place, that was approximately 30 feet long by 15 feet wide. And there were three pieces of furnishings that was placed there. As we would view it on the right-hand side, which would be the north side, there was a table of showbread. Then opposite to that, on the other wall, the tent wall, if you will, there was the candlestick, the golden candlestick. And then in front of the veil that separated the holy place from the most holy place, there was the altar of incense. Now, there were things that the priests were to do in reference to these furnishings. The table of showbread. There were 12 loaves placed on the table, and they were changed out every Sabbath day. The golden candlestick, it was trimmed and lit every day by the priest, okay? And then the altar of incense, that was kept going every day by the priest. They would look at that as being symbolic of their worship to God. And also these things were, as we would say, a type of, a shadow of that which was to come. The table of showbread is viewed as a type of the Lord's Supper. The golden candlestick is viewed as the Word of God because it gives forth light. That was only light inside there. And then the altar of incense was a type of we offering praise to God. That's symbolic of that. Then as you go through that veil that separated the holy place from the most holy place, in there was the Ark of the Covenant. And on top of that was placed the mercy seat. And the only one that could enter into that place, that section of the tabernacle, was the high priest. And he only entered into that section once a year. That's the only time anyone went in there. And so he entered into that most holy place once a year. And the high priest was the only one that could do that. And he would offer sacrifices, of course, which he did for himself and for the people. And so only in the holy place, priests were to go. They had things they were to do basically every day. But in the second section of the tabernacle, the most holy place, or also referred to as the Holy of Holies, only the high priest could go in. He only did that once a year. The tabernacle was a type of, that first section was a type of the church. It's pointing to the church. It's a shadow of the church that was to come. And then the most holy place was a type of heaven, where God was, and so it's a type of heaven. It's pointing to heaven. And so reminding us, symbolically, if you will, in order to get into heaven, we have to go through the church. Okay? And so the Hebrew writer is talking about the tabernacle and what it is a shadow of, what it's a type of, that which is to come. Or it's that which is real, that which is genuine. And so the Hebrew writer is going to be emphasizing to us, as glorious as the tabernacle was, and it was for them, we have something that's even greater and more glorious. And so we're talking about the church, we're talking about heaven itself, because these priests, they served in this tabernacle. The high priest, yes, only served in the most holy place once a year. But the other priests, those that were priests, they served in the tabernacle, doing various activities, things they were obligated to do. And they were doing that in that which was made by man. A tabernacle was made by man. Now God designed it. God planned it. But it was put in place, made by the hands of man. That's where the priest served. Now, Hebrew is going to remind us that Christ serves as our priest. He serves as our high priest now. But where he serves is in heaven. That which is not made by man's hands. Again, emphasizing how anything and everything connected to Christ was superior to and far better anything connected to the things of the old covenant or old law. So, as these words were being read by these brethren, hopefully they were getting the point. Do you really want to go back to that which is inferior? What you have now is greater, far better. Far better. So why would you even think about going back? Well, let's look at a few things. I've already mentioned some things that Hebrews chapter 9 is talking about. But let's look at a few of these verses here in Hebrews chapter 9. Then, verily, the first covenant. The first covenant is talking about the old covenant. Talking about the old law. Talking about the law of Moses, if you will. And so the first covenant had also ordinances, that is, ceremonies that they had to go through. They had a lot of them. A lot of them. A lot of gifts that were to be offered, a lot of sacrifices that were to be made, and all kinds of offerings that were given. All kinds of offerings. It's not just like one day they had a certain kind, there are all kinds of offerings that they had to do. And so he says had also ordinances or ceremonies of divine service and a worldly sanctuary. Yeah, worldly in a sense, it was made by the hands of men. Well, there was a tabernacle made. Again, reminding you, tabernacle, basically a large tent. A large tent. Approximately 45 feet by 15 feet wide. First section, approximately 30 by 15. The last section, the back section, the most holy place, was basically 15 feet by 15 feet. So it was made by hand. It was made by man. Now, for that was a tabernacle made. The first, we're talking about the first section, as you go into the tabernacle, two sections separated by a veil. And so the first section was the holy place. The first, wherein was the candlestick, and that was placed always on the south side. As we would go in on the east, as we would go in, it would be on what we refer to as the south, or the left-hand side, if you will. And then a table of showbread. There was a table and showbread on it. There were 2 rows, 6 loaves in each row. Replaced every Sabbath day. That was on the right-hand side, which would be the northern side, which is called the sanctuary. And after the second veil, now the first veil had reference to the entrance into the tabernacle. That's the first veil. I mean, you had to go through that. Only ones who could go through that were the priests. And they did how often? Every day. They did it daily. The priest going into the sanctuary. High priest, once a year. On what day was it that they went in? The day of atonement. That was the most holy day to the Jews. They had several feasts they observed, and there was a few special ones that they observed, but the Day of Atonement was the most holy day for the Jews. And after the second veil, this is the veil that separates the holy place from the most holy place, the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all. That is the most holy place, which had the golden censer and the ark of the covenant overlaid round about with gold, wherein was a golden pot that had manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tables of the covenant. And over it, the cherubims, and this was the mercy seat. At each end of the mercy seat, there were cherubims facing each other, of which we cannot now speak particularly. Now, when these things were thus ordained, the tabernacle and all the observances and all the things that were done in the tabernacle was put in place by God. Planned by God. Now man had to carry them out. They didn't decide what they were going to do in the tabernacle or even in the outer court. God had already put that in place. God gave them a pattern to follow in the erecting of that tabernacle and in their usage of the tabernacle and the outer court. Now, when these things were thus ordained, the priest went always into the first tabernacle, accomplishing the service of God. But into the second, remember the second is the second section of the tabernacle, went the high priest. Notice, alone. No one ever was to accompany him, and he was the only one that went in. And once every year. He couldn't decide one day, I think, well, that went pretty well. I think I'll go in next month. No, you're not. If he did, he would not come out alive. Okay? And so God specified once a year and on the Day of Atonement. And so he went in alone once every year. Now, not without blood, or as he went in with blood, for he offered for himself and for the errors of the people. The Holy Ghost, this signifying that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest, while as the first tabernacle was yet standing. And so this was a symbol of, this was signifying something that was to come, and it was a shadow of that which was to come, which would be the real thing. The real thing. At one time, we'll see later on that the people of God can enter into the church because we are priests, and we will also be able to enter into the most holy place, heaven itself, one day. And so, but these things are just types of, these are symbols of, symbolic of that which is to come. Which was, that's what he said in verse 9, which was a figure for the time then present, in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices that could not make him that did the service perfect or complete, as pertaining to the conscience. All those sacrifices, the ceremonies they went through, all their offerings that they made, could not make anyone perfect, sinless. It didn't happen. Could not happen. Or it did not clean their conscience. Whatever they did, the sacrifices, the offerings under the old law, the priest, it did not take care of the conscience of man, which stood only in meats and drinks and divers washings and carnal ordinances, imposed of them until the time of the Reformation, until the gospel age, until the coming of the Messiah, if you will. And so these things are going to be in place until then. Now, notice, in talking about Christ, we've already seen several verses in the book of Hebrews that talk about Christ. He is our high priest. Yes, he's holy, undefiled, and so forth. And so he is perfect, he is complete in serving as our high priest. And he can do that. And so everything he did was for our benefit. Now, notice what the Hebrew writer is doing. As you look at what the priests of old did, and even what the high priest of old did, now let's look at what's going to come to pass, what's in the future, in reference to Christ as our high priest, and why his priesthood is much better than their priesthood. But Christ, being come, verse 11, and high priest of good things to come. by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, where he is going to serve as our high priest is in a tabernacle that's greater and it is more perfect. And what is that tabernacle? Where does he serve from as our high priest? From heaven. Okay? Not made with man's hands. So that's why his service is much better, because he's serving from heaven. Not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building. Neither by the blood of bulls or goats and calves. And so he doesn't use the blood of goats and calves. He's not going to use the blood of animals as he serves as our high priest. That's not going to happen. That's what they had to use, the blood of animals. But our high priest is not going to use the blood of animals. I notice, but by his own blood, he entered in once into a holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. The priest, as they entered into the tabernacle, they did it often. In fact, they did it daily. And the high priest, remember, entered into the most holy. I know you've heard this several times, but you're going to keep on hearing it. The high priest entered into the most holy place once a year. And that's every year. That's every year. And as the priests, the high priests were changed out, and they only could serve a certain number of years, or unless they died first. And so they were changed out. But the high priest entered in to the most holy place once a year. Now, but Christ, he entered into the holy place once. And that's once for all. He doesn't have to make a sacrifice for man every year. But he made that sacrifice once. And having made that sacrifice, he sat down on the right hand of the throne of God. And is now sitting on the throne of God, at the right hand of God, ruling over his kingdom and serving as our high priest. And he used his own blood. Now, what did he obtain by doing that? He obtained eternal redemption for us. We can have this because of what he did. That is our high priest, because of what he did. With the blood of bulls and of goats and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean, sanctified to the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience. Remember, the Hebrew writers already mentioned that when the priest used the blood of animals and in these sacrifices and so forth, one thing it could not do, and it dealt with the conscience. It could not cleanse the conscience of man. But what Jesus did, our high priest did, it can do that. Purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. And for this cause, he is a mediator of the New Testament. The word testament is used in the book of Hebrews, sometimes having reference to like a covenant. There's agreement between the parties that are involved in that covenant. Also, it is used in reference to what we refer to today like a will. that has been put in place. And so it's used both ways. And even here in chapter 9. And we'll see that in just a moment. So he's a mediator of the New Testament. That by means of death, that is his death, and whenever he talks about his death, he's talking about his shed blood. Not I'm talking about just his dying, but his shed blood. Because there is a significance of blood throughout the Bible. God placed a significance upon blood. Used to be the blood of animals. But now, under the New Covenant, the New Testament, it is the blood of Jesus Christ. The means of death for the redemption of the transgressions that were under the First Testament. And notice there's a connection of his death, his shed blood. There's a connection with that with those who lived under the first covenant. That's what it's saying. That by means of death, his death, for the redemption of the transgressions that were under the First Testament. And as you know, those transgressions, those sins were never forgiven completely. Basically, the first covenant, what it did was simply remembered their sins every year. That's what it did. That was not forgiveness. That was a remembrance of their sin. Not like under the new covenant, not like under the blood of Christ, our sins can be forgiven once and for all. Well, that wasn't true under the First Testament, the first covenant. But when Christ died on the cross and he shed his blood, there was a connection now with his blood shedding and with the transgressions under the First Testament. That is the old law. They which are called might receive the promise of eternal inheritance. Sometimes we talk about, his blood flowed. Yes, it's going to flow forward. We understand that. As long as we walk in the lives he is in light, the blood of Christ cleanseth us, continues to do so, and as we walk in the light. But it also flows backward. What his blood did, it also made it possible for those people to be justified by God. And so his blood not only is attached to the future of mankind, in other words, it's available, but it's also attached to those who faithfully lived under the old law. That's how significant that his blood is. For where a testament is, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is of force after men are dead, otherwise it is of no strength at all while the testator liveth. Now, the word testament here is used as a will. And you know what a will is. Some of you probably have wills. And you have certain conditions stated in that will, and so-and-so is going to get this, and so-and-so is going to get that, and all that kind of stuff. And so the person who has that will has the right to, as we would say, dish out the things that the person has. And he can stipulate in that will who's going to get what. And if you're not listed in that will, then you're not supposed to get anything. And that's where it goes. Yeah, we know what's happened in the past with wills and all that kind of stuff. And you all see some really fighting and arguing among family. That happens sometimes, the reading of a will. Well, why did he get this? Why did she get this? Why didn't I get that? That's not fair. Well, first of all, it's not your will. And you were not asked about it, I'm sure. But when does that will go into effect? That will goes into effect when that person dies. Before he dies, he can do what he wants to with what he has. If he decides to give most of the stuff away, he can do that. But after the will goes into effect, then the conditions of that will must be applied. And so that's what the Hebrew writer is talking about. And so when you look at this from the standpoint, we have the new covenant. We have the New Testament. This is a new will, the new will for man. And the Lord has stipulated certain things in that will. And if you want to receive this, here are the conditions that you must follow. Here's the conditions you must go by. Now, as long as Christ was alive, he could do what he wanted to. And so, well, how about, people always want to bring up the thief on the cross. Well, Christ could forgive anybody he wants to prior to his death. His will did not go into effect until after he died. And he was still living. Yes, he was on the cross, but he was still living when he was talking to that thief on the cross. I find it amazing sometimes when people, they always want to bring up the thief on the cross when it comes to their own salvation. Oh, I want to be saved like the thief on the cross. Do you really? When we say he lived under the old law. He lived under the old covenant. And you can't be saved like a thief on the cross. Well, I know he was not baptized. You don't know any such thing. The Bible doesn't teach either way. It does not specifically state whether he was baptized or not. It really doesn't make any difference. Because he was living under the old covenant law, not the new covenant law. So why use the thief on the cross? I've never heard anybody use, for example, you remember the account of the rich young ruler? Okay? He came running to Jesus and said, what do I need to do to have eternal life? And Jesus told him basically, keep the commandments. He said, I kept those from my youth up. What lack I yet? What did Jesus say to him? You remember? Go and do what? Sell what you have. And give to the poor. Then come and follow me. Have you ever heard anybody say, I want to be saved like that? I've never heard anybody say that. Why not? And so while Jesus was alive, while Christ was alive, he could do what he wanted to in reference to saving mankind in whatever way he desired. His will only went into effect after, of course, he died. Verse 18, whereupon neither the first testament was dedicated without blood. There was blood that was attached to the first covenant. It was dedicated with blood as well. And he talks about Moses and what he did. And verse 22, and almost all things are by the law purged with blood, and without shedding of blood is no remission. There is no freedom apart from the shedding of blood. Verse 24, for Christ has not entered into the holy places made with hands, which are the figures of the true holy place, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Nor yet that he should offer himself often. The priests of old offered sacrifices, gifts, offerings often. Christ he doesn't do that. He entered into the holy place every year with the blood of others. That's what the high priest of old did. For then must he often have suffered since the foundation of the world. But now once in the end of the world hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And so he came into this world, and when he came to this world, it was to be a sacrifice for the sins of mankind. And he did that once. And as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this, the judgment. So Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many. And unto them that look for him shall he appear the second time without sin unto salvation. He's not coming back the second time to be a sacrifice for sin. That he's already done. But he's coming back for his people to deliver them unto God. Brother Fred, will you lead us in a word of prayer, please?
Our Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for this time to get together, first day of the week, to worship Thee, to study Thy Word. Come, Father, help us to apply the things we learn here from Your Word to our lives so we can serve You better. Help us to always put You first in our lives. Help us to realize that the sacrifice Thy Son made on our behalf, giving His life on Calvary's cross. Help us now as we start to go into our hour of worship. Help us to be attentive and open our hearts to Thy Word. In Christ's name we pray.
Hallelujah.